Hi class, remember that we left off talking about trophic cascades in class and that we looked at a couple of examples, and I don't want to take a lot of time to review everything here. We also talked about bottom up versus top down control, and that's where we kind of left off. So remember the wolf example and the fact that we can have both positive and negative effects as well as direct and indirect effects. And we looked at the influence of wolves on the populations of these other species here. Okay, and we finally left off also talking about an example of bottom-up control, because one of the things that we wanted to be looking at is the relative importance of bottom-up versus top-down control in different systems. And in this particular system, we looked at how fertilizer can cause increases in plant growth in terms of tissue nitrogen in dry weight or in fresh weight. Sorry about that. And the idea is that the fertilizer can cause plants to grow to a greater extent, which is not surprising, right? That's what these two graphs show here. But that increase in plant growth can translate into changes in the population sizes of beetles, okay? So the two different beetle species here in red and blue are not that important. We're just kind of looking at the overall effects of fertilizer on insects, okay? So notice how we're one trophic level up here, or skipping a trophic level by looking at fertilizer effects on insects, because of course the plants are in between. And what we can see is that there's bottom-up control that's happening, because when you have higher amounts of fertilizer, you have greater number of females. I'm not sure why this keeps happening. Maybe that will help. We have higher numbers of female beetles, both in terms of the reproductive females as well as just total number of females. So you can see that as fertilizer goes up, there's more insects in both of these instances here. Okay. So one of the things that I want you guys to think about, and that we'll get to in class next week, is this example of the removal of sharks in this system, does this support top-down or bottom-up control? Just looking at the relative abundance of sharks versus rays and skates versus scallops. And of course, rays and skates feed on scallops, and sharks feed on rays and skates. So tell me whether this data here is supporting a top-down or bottom-up control model. I also want you to look at this example here, and what we have again is fertilizer that can influence the growth of salt marsh plants and the population size of salt marsh plants, which can in turn affect the number of sap-sucking insects. Okay, but these insects are also attacked by parasitoid. We've talked about parasitoids before, and these parasitoid flies can therefore affect the population numbers of sap-sucking insects as well. So the question is, are the bottom-up effects here more important than the top-down effects in influencing the population size of the sap-sucking insects? In order to answer that question, we want to look at this data. Okay, so there's some experiments that were done, and there's two different species of salt marsh plants here. Okay, and the differences between the plants aren't as important to focus on as the difference between the treatments. All right, so we have a control, we have a treatment where the parasitoids were removed, we have a treatment where we added fertilizer, okay, and then we have a combined treatment where we have fertilizer and parasitoid removal. Okay, and then on the left here is the percent foliar nitrogen. So here we're looking at the plant growth. How did these treatments affect the growth of plants? All right, and on the right is our sap-sucking insects. Okay, so this is where the question comes in, is really looking at the right-hand graph. So we want to compare these different treatments for the number of sap-sucking insects. And there may be differences between the two salt marsh plants, but that's not as important as looking again at the difference between the treatments here. And does this data support top-down or bottom-up effects is more important. Okay, we're going to come back to that in class. So think about that question because I'm not answering it for you right now. Remember that we did look at this these diagrams in class, and we were talking about the difference between trophic interactions in food webs, like who eats who, right? And then we also said that we can look at other horizontal interactions such as competitive effects or mutualisms or commensalisms. And when we looked at trophic facilitation, we saw that interactions were important in those webs. So I want to talk a little bit more about competitive effects and other so-called horizontal interactions. In many ways, having a network that's more circular can cause the direct effects of competition to be somewhat buffered, and this can result in the fact that no one species will end up dominating the interaction. Okay? In this more linear view where you have a competitive hierarchy, you got A directly competing with B and B competing with C, that species A is always going to dominate this interaction in the way that this is drawn. But when you have this circular network going on, these indirect effects can buffer the effect. For example, if A is strongly affecting B, but B is strongly affecting C, we have an indirect effect here between A and C. Let's use an actual example so that it may make this a little bit clearer. In the marine environment, encrusting invertebrates are really common. There are all kinds of invertebrates such as sponges, encrusting corals. There are things called bryozoans. There's also algae. Everything's like searching for space in this crowded environment. This is a hard coral on the right here. These are some encrusting algae on the left. There's what are called coralline algae that look a little bit pinker over here. But the point is that with all of these encrusting organisms trying to compete for space on the rocks, we could do a series of experiments looking at removing one and removing the other. And what we find is that there's no one species that actually dominates here. Okay, so one kind of overgrowing the other kind of coming in and encrusting over that this actually supports the idea of these competitive networks, because the indirect interactions that can help remove space or free up space rather by removing another species for another one to come in actually ends up promoting diversity. Okay, so one species coming in, removing the other, clearing out the space, can often result in allowing another species to invade. And so the kind of equal competitive interactions promotes diversity within the community. So this is an example of this competitive network where no one species consistently wins. To summarize the kinds of things that we want to think about in terms of interactions, okay, so these interactions may be predation, they may be competition, they may be mutualism, and the strength of those interactions, which is the effect of one species on the abundance of another species. So the effect of that species may be really strong, or it may be kind of weak, okay, and it can vary quite a bit in different systems and across species. So there's a lot of variation in how strong the interaction can be, and even between any two particular species, it may vary given a set of different kinds of circumstances. For example, it may vary depending on external environmental factors like abiotic factors, all right, and that we can measure the strength of an interaction with good old removal studies, which we've talked about again and again and again. Removing one species to see the effect on the other can tell us how strong that interaction was, and does it change with different environmental factors. And in fact, this